This is A View from the Bunker. Now, here's Derek Gilbert.
Depending on which expert you ask, it's either the oldest temple in the world, the oldest astronomical observatory in the world, or perhaps something else altogether. Welcome to A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert, joining me as he does every year at this time. And this year, taking a little different tack in our annual conversation, just ahead of the Halloween festivities, is a gentleman that, I was just looking through the archives and realized it's been almost 11 years to the day since the first time we spoke, back in 2009, not long after launching this podcast. He is the director of the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, the author of Interview with the Giant, Ethno-Historical Notes on the Nephilim Dossier, and a forthcoming book that will be the basis for our conversation tonight, about the mysterious place called Gobekli Tepe. We welcome back to the bunker our friendly neighborhood PhD, Dr. Judd Burton. Judd, good to talk with you again, brother.
Good to talk with you too, Derek.
Gobekli Tepe. Now, normally this time of year we'll talk about the supernatural realm. Is there anything...
There's a tie-in. There's a tie-in.
Okay, well, I wondered about that because I know that there are a lot of people who are curious about Gobekli Tepe, and there's a lot of speculation about what that place was. Now, for people not familiar with Gobekli Tepe, what is it exactly?
Gobekli Tepe is a pre-pottery Neolithic or Mesolithic site in eastern Turkey, kind of southeastern Turkey, and it dates back to the middle of the 11th millennium BC. And it's interesting insofar as that it represents a 90-degree angle cultural trajectory change for human culture, and it marks the really the first time that you begin to see a kind of transition from the more animistic, totemistic forms of religion to the reverence of more anthropomorphic deities, more human-like deities. And it's a vast complex. I think it's something like 300 square meters, encompasses the entire temple complex. You know, it's basically a site that's filled with these rings, many of which have yet to be excavated. There's still a lot of work there to be done, but for all intents and purposes, this is the oldest temple structure that we know of in the world, and certainly the oldest temple structure that we know of where the gods are anthropomorphic and not theriomorphic, not beast-like or animal-like or totem-like.
So pre-pottery Neolithic, that means prior to the Copper Age of the Chalcolithic, which of course preceded the Bronze Age. So we're talking way
right
back in history, back as far as, well, certainly before writing. What sort of evidence did the culture leave there, and what do we know about them? I mean, where did they go when they left Gobekli Tepe?
Well, the structures themselves were built by. It seems like they were built by a number of different societies. You know, they were coming in from different parts of Eurasia, basically, and probably the biggest material imprint on the site itself in terms of culture probably came from the Natufians. Gobekli Tepe is kind of at the northern end of the Natufian cultural sphere, which stretches all the way down into the Levant. And for listeners who have been to Israel, you may have even visited some Natufian sites in Israel, like Jericho. There's a huge watchtower and the remnants of a wall there. But suffice to say that this was a joint effort between different hunter-gatherer societies, and so they were all drawn to this place to build this very atypical, for the times, this very atypical structure that was devoted to a different kind of deity, a markedly different kind of deity than they had been worshiping before. And again, just as a frame of reference, we're talking about around 10,500 BC would be the oldest limit, and it, interestingly enough, would be backfilled, a couple thousand years later. But we can talk about that later. But in terms of material culture, what you find there is very similar to not only other period Anatolian sites like nearby Navali Chari and even Shanlurfa, which is a whole other bag of worms. We can talk about Shanlurfa in a minute too. Mm-hmm. But the biggest material cultural imprint seems to come from this shared Eastern Anatolian Natufian pre-pottery Neolithic culture, because you find things like the way that they inter their dead is very similar. That is the treatment of the body, in many cases laid out for the animals to pick clean, and then they would inter the skeleton, and then they would also many times take the skulls and sort of refashion the features with clay and seashells and things like that.
Oh, okay. I'm aware that they did that at Jericho, but I did not know that was at Gobekli Tepe as well.
Yeah, there are sites in eastern Turkey where you find those similar practices. So there's some definite linkages between that. And like I say, just ethnologically speaking, the corridor, if you want to call it that, the Natufian corridor does stretch up into eastern Anatolia. So, there's definitely going to be some diffusion of ideas and culture and obviously religion. But the nexus of where this all seems to sit in terms of actually building a temple structure devoted to whatever these entities were was Eastern Turkey. And Dr. Judkins and I have our own reasons for believing why that was so.
And I should point out that the forthcoming book is co-authored by you and Dr. Aaron Judkins and will be published by Defender Publishing, which is something we're very excited about, which means we'll probably get to look at early copies.
That's right.
The change then from these theriomorphic or hybrid human-animal deities that we find in older civilizations to more humanoid deities at Gobekli Tepe. And again, for people who have heard the name but aren't aware of this, the dig only began there about 1996. So this is fairly recent.
95, yeah.
Okay,
under Klaus Schmidt. Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we're only going back like 25 years on this,
right.
Which again just blows my mind, because a lot of the even sites like Ugarit, which was found about 100 years ago, some of those texts have only been really translated, or scholars have only agreed on translations within the last 40 years. So we're really in the first generation to see a lot of this stuff that impacts. But the question, and I'm taking too long to get to, is this: what do you think caused this sudden shift from these older hybrid animalistic deities to humanoid?
Well, personally, as a believer and a scholar, I think that there was Watcher influence here, just as you have at Mount Hermon. Now, I should qualify this with a little bit of context. And in coming to this decision, it wasn't only my familiarity with the biblical text and the apocryphal material, but also I wanted to combine that with an anthropological approach. And so when you see these drastic, they're precedent for drastic cultural changes in societies. But very often what you have when those changes occur is you often have now for the purposes of this argument, we're talking about humans. Okay, we'll get to the Watchers and celestial beings. Mm-hmm. But when you have these drastic cultural changes, these huge, paradigm upon paradigm shift changes, they often occur because of outside influence. Now, when you consider, I'll give you a couple of examples here. Consider the cargo cults of the South Pacific.
Okay.
If listeners aren't familiar with those, these were they were literally indigenous peoples of South Pacific islands who were impacted by the emergence of technologies like first airplanes, and then when the big conflicts like World War II came along, and the Allies were dropping all kinds of supplies all over the South Pacific, in case people were captured or were stranded or whatever, and they wanted to keep them, alive. And for people who are familiar with that time period, they know that there were all kinds of canned foods and, Spam and candy and cigarettes and bubble gum and razors and, medical supplies and all that kind of thing. Well, in the minds of these pre-literate, pre-industrial people, they're looking at these flying things as these kind of celestial entities, and they're dropping these gifts down upon them. And so they begin to make representations on the ground of these flying machines that they didn't know how to contextualize. And when the cargo dropping ceased, you see an increase in these kind of airplane-shaped totems that they were building because they thought that they had displeased the gods. So here is a literally, a 90-degree angle cultural change in the religious consciousness of these people by this outside influence. And I'll give you another example, which is probably more applicable to the outside influence at Gobekli Tepe, particularly when you're considering that these are technologically superior celestial entities that are influencing human culture. And there were there were causes. There were these distal, far-reaching causes that were already set up that put this superior, force. Let's just say, in the case of the Watchers, that put them in a place to change drastically human culture. But by way of analogy, an excellent example is Jared Diamond's study of the clash between the old world and the new world in his book Guns, Germs, and Steel. Mm. And the way he contextualizes this is really, really interesting. Now, Diamond is an evolutionist, and I am not, but I think that the point that he makes about the cultural development in Eurasia versus the cultural development in North America is applicable here, and I think is valid because he looks at things like geography, epidemiology, and material culture development. So in Eurasia, you've got the continent itself is long east to west, and so when you have things like agriculture and pastoralism and metallurgy that develop, the diffusion of those ideas, they don't have the geographical barriers to overcome, and the climate is similar along those latitudes, so that they can spread from east to west in both directions. Mm-hmm. And so in the old world, you have herd animals that develop. And because of our association with herd animals, particularly bovine animals, we over the years we inoculate ourselves basically against anthrax and smallpox and things like that, which were originally diseases that were present amongst bovine and other herd animals. And metallurgy and that kind of technology spreads pretty quickly. Historically speaking, relatively quickly. Right.
One people group comes up with a metal that makes for better weapons, and suddenly everybody's got to get their hands on it. Right.
Exactly. Exactly. And so this sort of thing feeds the spread of fill in the blank, whatever you want to say, agriculture, metallurgy, pastoralism, the kind of core elements of civilization. Contrast that with the Americas, which as a supercontinent is long north to south, mm-hmm. which means that you have great variation in geography, you have great variation in climate, and so it makes it more difficult for things like agriculture, and of course they didn't develop extensive metallurgy in the New World, but let's just say that the elements of civilization did not spread easily or quickly beyond the confines of Mesoamerica.
Right.
You find, there's some stuff in South America too, but it's, most of it is essentially in Mesoamerica if we were categorizing it as civilization. And there were no herd animals to speak of that they raised, and so they by the time that you get to the 15th century, when this big clash takes place, you can certainly talk about the pugilistic militarism of the Spanish especially, but the French and the English too. The Spanish were fresh off of the war with the Moors, and so you had all these soldiers who were not only well trained, but they were looking for a job. Mm-hmm. That brutalism is certainly part of the narrative, the historical narrative of the eradication of a lot of the indigenous peoples of the New World. But the fact of the matter remains is that there were all these other things because of geography and epidemiology that made them technologically superior, and they also had this sort of unconscious biological weapon that they were bringing with them, the diseases that the Native Americans were not prepared to fight against, and just because they didn't have the pathogens to do that, it was the diseases that finished off a substantial portion of the population of the New World. There certainly was depredation, military depredation, but you kind of see what I'm saying is that there was this outside influence that was technologically superior. It had millennia to basically become, get this superior position. And I'm not talking morally superior. I'm just talking, in terms of technology, essentially technology and knowledge, and this sort of unconscious biological warfare that was being waged. Mm-hmm. And so here is another great example, because Native American culture was never the same. There were whole tribes that disappeared because of this, and the Native American culture that remained was drastically changed because of this outside influence. Now, what does that all have to do with Gobekli Tepe and the possibility of a watcher presence there? Well, we can look at the Mount Hermon episode in the apocryphal material, the Genesis 6 episode. We can look at that and we get a very good textual narrative of just how drastic that outside incursion was for the people living in that region. Human culture was never the same after that.
Oh, well, that's one of the things that the Book of Enoch, or First Enoch, more properly, actually details, is it makes clear that the sin of the watchers was not just the intermingling of the species that was prohibited. It was the teaching of things, of technology and, spiritual practices that had been forbidden by God. Right. So it was a total cultural change.
Absolutely. And by that same token, sort of going the next step and tying in the work that people like Klaus Schmidt have done. And, Klaus Schmidt himself was a capable, wonderful archaeologist, and had, just literally wrote the book on Gobekli Tepe. But he certainly didn't subscribe to the spiritual, much less the biblical view of Gobekli Tepe. He acknowledged that this was a religious site, but he doesn't subscribe to the worldview that we do. But when you apply that with the anthropological models, it does reveal some rather interesting things. Schmidt himself, routinely characterized the religious ideology of these people, when writing about Gobekli Tepe, and he routinely talks about this place as being a portal to the underworld.
Oh, really?
Or a portal to the other to another place, and that it was. I used to tell my students that the site it's the paradigm that breaks the paradigm, because we used to think that in order for city-states, civilization to begin to develop, you had to have these certain things in place. And the foundation of all that, for the longest time, we thought, was the development of agriculture, usually through independent, invention. Well, the thing that blew my mind about Gobekli Tepe was when Klaus Schmidt said that agriculture did not come first at Gobekli Tepe, that it was religion that brought all of these people together. In other words, there was some sort of religious impetus for them to come together to build this massive 300 square meter complex. And in order to have a stable, fairly replicable, and predictable food source, agriculture was epiphenomenal of the development of the Gobekli Tepe complex. Which leaves us with the question, who set this religion up? What was the spark, the reason that brought all of these people, from not only nearby sites, but some rather distant places like the Levant, to build structures like we see at Gobekli Tepe?
So now, by the Levant, you mean people were coming from as far away as modern-day Lebanon, Jordan, and Israel up to southeastern Turkey to help construct this site?
Yes, and there are some people that say that there were people that were coming in from beyond. I'm trying to remember the name of the guy that wrote the paper, but that there were people coming from beyond the Caspian Sea to build this thing. Now, you would have natural thoroughfares like the Urals and the Caucasus that people could follow down to this region. But some of these people were apparently crossing some pretty significant geographical hurdles to get there.
Yeah, if they're coming from the other side of the Caspian, you've got a lot of mountains in between there. But even just getting up from Israel meant having to, going by way of, through Palmyra, Tadmor, and up the Euphrates. Still not an easy journey because you were still crossing some desert area. That's a long way to go for just a religious type of. I think we lost our connection there for a moment, but I see you're back now. That was a long way to go for a religious pilgrimage. Yeah, back in that day and age, I mean, we tend to forget how difficult it was to travel back in the day when you didn't have rest stops, convenience marts, and fast food places all along the highways.
Your food was fast, but it was on four legs.
Yeah, so which means you had to be faster or you had to be pretty good with a bow. Wow,
and that's the other interesting thing here is that these people were not farmers; they were hunter-gatherers. In other words, the people that built this were not already farming, but they were still primarily hunter-gatherers, and they continued to supplement their regular crops of probably what was emmer wheat with their lifeways that they had for millennia.
So, and again, to re-emphasize the point made by Schmidt, who was the director of the dig there beginning in 1995, it wasn't agriculture that brought these people together to form a civilization there at Gobekli Tepe. They didn't come there, start farming, form a collective, and then decide, okay, let's build a temple here. It was the temple first, and then to support all the people coming to either build or worship, that's where they started to produce food there.
That's right. And even if most later or even interim, sort of proto-civilization cities, settlements that developed, were developed because of agriculture. If we're looking at the earliest end of that, the oldest end of that, and you see that it's not, the implementation of growing this emmer wheat, but it's religion. It's an ideological change that sets the foundation, and agriculture and hierarchy of society and the centralized political structure, all of that comes after this religious impetus to build this temple site and the actual building of the structures themselves.
So this site, according to Schmidt, a portal to somewhere else. What have the finds there, the stelae and the statues, the iconography? What clues do we have from the culture that built this as to what they were trying to get in contact with, or what were they worshiping?
Well, one theory is that the reason that their gods were becoming anthropomorphic is that they, for millennia, and of course this is the sort of processual cultural evolutionary explanation of it, is that these are, their dead ancestors, and they're beginning to look at their dead ancestors as gods. And that certainly may play into part of it, mm-hmm. but if there was a watcher presence there, then the idea for, and this is outside of the conventional scholarship, the conventional scholarship, as I said, will tell you that this was they were looking to get into the afterlife, the world of the gods. But if you look at this through the biblical lens, and if the timeline, lines up with the events of the pre-flood world, which I believe that it does, you're looking at watcher influence here. The other world that they're trying to get into, that they're trying to access, is the celestial realm, or the, if you want to use it in terms of multidimensionality, whatever underworld that they're trying to access to, the realm of their ancestor gods, or what have you. All of those things would be applicable. And I think there's a reason why that's the case, because certainly in Genesis, we have another example of an attempt to basically either enter or more than likely try to assault heaven in mm-hmm. the case of the Tower of Babel. But I think that Gobekli Tepe represents an earlier attempt to do that, and there are other reasons that link sacred geography and the story of the Watchers to this earlier attempt. And so that's another thing that I believe is happening here. You're looking at another attempt to not only access the divine world, but also to try and begin an assault to retake it.
Oh.
Because when you look at the Luciferian plan from the beginning, what did he want to do? He wanted to topple God from his throne and take over, and that's never ceased to be part of the agenda.
No, that is really fascinating. So you've got a pre-Babel Babel in a sense. Mm-hmm. What is it about the finds there that lead you to that conclusion?
Well, I'm of the mind that, and I know that there are certainly other scholars who have made cases for the Garden of Eden being, where the Persian Gulf is right now. Mm-hmm. I know that there are theories that have the Garden of Eden being on the location of Mount Zion. Mm-hmm. But I remain confident in the idea that Eden was in Anatolia somewhere, because if you're going off of the geographical information that we have, I mean, we can debate until the cows come home about two of the rivers, but we know
the Tigris and Euphrates, yeah,
or two of them are the Tigris and the Euphrates, and those headwaters are in eastern Turkey, eastern mm-hmm. Anatolia. And what that says is that even though there was drastic change since geographical change since the flood, whatever general path that those rivers took, they resettled into, and so I remain pretty sanguine about Eden being in the region of eastern Anatolia, or at least central Anatolia. And there's some interesting things to tease out here. As Eden is described, Eden is probably a borrowed word from Akkadian and Sumerian. There's a word Edenu, which means a plateau or plain. The connotation being that it was a fruitful, verdant, well-watered place. And so Eden, you could think of as a territory or a country. The garden, we're also given pretty detailed description as to where it is. It was in the east of Eden, and the great river that watered this place split into these 4 rivers, 2 of which we know, the Euphrates and the Tigris. Well, we know the general story of what happened at Eden, right? Okay, Adam and Eve, they get kicked out. There's another drastic change for you, but there was something interesting about Eden. It must have been this place where that God had partitioned out to begin to cultivate the line of the Messiah, the line of his people. And that's not to say that there weren't other cultures around, but God partitioned this place off, and it must have been a place, obviously it was a place where the heavenly realm somehow touched the earthly realm, because we get descriptions of Adam and Eve. They can talk to God, and he walks around in the garden with them, and there's this, they don't need the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because they can just ask God, why is the sky blue? Well, just because I made it blue. There's a lot of water on earth, or fill in the blank. They could just it's like having the ultimate information management system. It's right there. You just ask the question, and boom, you got the answer. And so it was this place where, if you want to think about it in quantum terms, these 2 dimensions were allowed to touch. In other words, you had access to the heavenly realm from the earth. Now, that gets shut off, of course, really quickly. Adam and Eve are expelled from the garden. Their mortality, is explicated at this point, and there's a cherub with a flaming sword, whatever form that takes, put to guard the opening, the gate to Eden, so that it's cut off from humanity at this point. But those stories survived and were passed along, and that whatever time span existed between the expulsion from the garden and the building of sites like Gobekli Tepe and Novalchari and some of those Mesolithic sites, because of its location, it would have been, the watchers would have known about this anyway. They would have known what had happened here. They would have known that this was a place where the heavenly realm and the earthly realm were allowed to sort of overlap to some degree. And so if you're thinking about this in terms of military strategy, they're probably thinking, okay, is there a way that we can overthrow the cherub that's at the gate because of our numbers or what have you, or can we convince him to join our coup? And, there are probably other options, but those are 2, just in terms of military strategy that come to mind, particularly when you think about the Babel episode. What are they trying to do? They're trying to basically do the same thing, right, through this mechanism that they call the Tower of Babel, the Gate of God, or what have you, Gate of Gods. By analogy, I think that the same thing is happening at Gobekli Tepe, because if Eden and the Garden of Eden is in eastern Anatolia, Gobekli Tepe is in southeastern Anatolia. It's at almost at the very headwaters of the Euphrates River. And so you could think of Gobekli Tepe as a kind of, not just a religious outpost, but it was a military outpost.
In the spirit realm.
In a spiritual sense, in the spiritual realm.
That is really intriguing. I wonder, have you considered where in time this might fall in terms of the Old Testament narrative, the patriarchal narrative? I'm trying to remember which of the...
You're talking about
Well, which of the patriarchs in Genesis, and I'm not remembering it off the top of my head, that where people began to call on the name of the Lord, and I'm wondering if is there a connection there? Maybe this is sort of a hidden reference to. It wasn't really that they were trying to call on the name of the Lord; it's that they were, demanding re-entry in a sense.
Right.
Now, maybe that's a stretch. I'd have to look at the original Hebrew and see if there are any other. Clues that might support that, but this just something off the top of my head. But again, sounding like a pre-Babel and a pre-flood Babel.
Well, it had to have been it's sometime in terms of the antediluvian timeline, which again is a very debatable issue depending on what chronology people subscribe to.
Sure,
but we're talking about a period between, again, if we're to believe the apocryphal accounts like 1 Enoch, the days of Jared, and then you have the Noahic period. So it's one of the antediluvian patriarchs between Jared and between Noah when this is taking place. And of course, Noah is going to be Noah and Methuselah and Enoch. They're going to be privy to they're going to be proximate to the events of the flood, and they likely would have seen Gobekli Tepe. They would have been well aware of Gobekli Tepe, although geographically they're living in the Natufian, would have probably been living in the Natufian quarter. It's only after the flood that Noah ends up in eastern Anatolia, basically. But isn't it interesting that you have this overlapping geography? You have Eden, and then you have Noah and his descendants ending up in eastern Anatolia, and then there's another layer of sacred geography too. I believe that Abraham's Ur was also in this region, the modern city of Shanlurfa, and we can get into that in a moment. But this region of eastern Anatolia is significant for so many reasons, looking at it through the biblical lens. But in terms of which patriarch we're dealing with here, you have to remember that these patriarchs were also living very long lives, centuries long lives. So you've got a lot of overlap, in terms of their lives as well. But that period between Jared and Noah is the era that we're dealing with here. And I think that lines up with the late in my professional anthropological historical opinion. I believe that lines up with the late Pleistocene, the Mesolithic period, the Younger Dryas. I think that all those events are kind of culminating at that time. Okay,
Younger Dryas was when? I'm familiar with the term, but I can't place the dates.
It's a geological designation of the basically the geoclimatic changes that are taking place, and it coincides with the end of the Pleistocene epoch. So we're talking, the 9000s, 8000s BC.
Okay.
End of the Pleistocene, beginning of the Holocene epoch.
Okay. For people, because I'm sure there are listeners out there who are already on the answer, shouting it at their earbuds or whatever, however they're listening to this. It was Genesis 4:26, Derek. It was Enosh, the son of Seth. Genesis 4:26 reads, "To Seth also a son was born, and he called his name Enosh. At that time, people began to call on the name of Yahweh." But whether that has anything to do with what we're discussing, I don't know. That's just something that came to mind. What's really interesting, too, about the days of Jared is that the renowned Belgian scholar Edward Lipinski, in a paper that he wrote almost 40 years ago now on El's abode, in which he found two potential locations for the abode of El, one being what he called the Semitic Olympus, which was Mount Hermon, although he did admit there was some evidence that might point to Mount Zaphon, which is where Baal's palace was located. But he also put El's abode in the mountains of Armenia, which of course is the mountains of Ararat, roughly speaking, where the ark came to rest. He also pointed out in the context of this article, this is one of those papers that I've had to read like 12 times because every time I go through it, I find something else really, really interesting. The patriarch Jared is the etymology of that name is derived from the same Semitic root as the Jordan River, Yared, which means to come down.
Uh-huh.
And the implication most draw from that is that this was when the Watchers came down from heaven on Mount Hermon. But Lipinski, but Lipinski also pointed out that the Yared was a ritual. It was a libation ritual. And that when you climb to the summit of Mount Hermon, you find that the summit itself is scooped out. This is what Sir Charles Warren found in September of 1869 when he found that stela there that was engraved in Greek. And by the way, Dr. Doug Hamp, and I'm not going to give anything away, but he's done some research on that stela and come to a pretty startling conclusion on what it says. But as it was translated by Clermont Ganneau in 1903 and by George W.E. Nicholsburg, who is the Enochian scholar from the University of Iowa, was that by the order of the
great work,
by the order of the Most High and Holy God, or the Great and Holy God, those who swore an oath proceed from here. Okay, well, you proceed on from that temple where Warren found that stela, and you climb up to the summit, which requires you, by the way, circumambulating the summit with the summit on your left, which is why Warren wondered if maybe the practice of circumambulating the Kaaba in counterclockwise fashion might have originated on the summit of Hermon, but I digress. The summit is scooped out to receive a libation, a drink offering. And as Lipinski pointed out, we have other evidence from the ancient world that this was practiced all over in the Mediterranean world. In fact, in the 3rd century A.D., Emperor Diocletian at the city of Tyre left an inscription saying that he performed the Yared, pouring out the libation, the drink offering, for the chief god of that city, Melkart. So the question that Lipinski raised is, was it in the days that the Watchers came down, or was it in the days that this drink offering was performed in this scooped out area on the summit of Hermon that the Watchers descended? So, again, it's interesting. And maybe the two are connected. Maybe it was the Watchers' descent that then said, you must pour out a drink offering to us, because as Sharon and I have discovered through our research, that was a key element in the monthly and sometimes twice monthly rituals for the dead performed by the ancient Amorites. Absolutely. Called Kispum. They had to pour out the drink offering. The son, the eldest son, the heir, was called the pourer of water for that reason.
Yeah. And that ritual in a general sort of a way you can find in the religions of Eurasia going both directions. You can find it in the Mediterranean basin. You can find it all the way into India and Central Asia as well.
Well, you find it in Africa as well, which is something that we learned just recently as the Black Lives Matter movement has taken it to the streets of America. And,
that's right. Yeah, I didn't even think about that. Yeah.
But the executive director, Patrice Cullors, has made a point of saying, well, this is a spiritual work, and this is based on the Yoruba tradition, Yoruba being the people of Western Nigeria.
West Africa.
Yeah, but according to their history, and I'm certainly not an expert, but what little I've read on their history was that they actually emigrated from the region of Sudan in the 8th century AD when they were pushed out by the Muslims. So they certainly had contact with the cultures of the ancient Near East that performed this ritual for thousands of years before they moved to West Africa. So we may,
if they have Nubian roots, they certainly did.
Yes, exactly. So this is something that we're seeing on the streets of America today when they call the names or say the names of those who have died in encounters with police, and then pour out a drink offering. I've got a video that I showed at a presentation recently for the Hear the Watchman virtual conference, which incidentally got that conference pulled offline. Because apparently that was hate speech. Showing the video of them doing this in a Methodist church in Hollywood, by the way, pouring out this drink offering, this libation, which may have originated as far back as in the days of Jared, the Yared, possibly on Mount Hermon, or possibly even elsewhere.
Yeah.
As at Gobekli Tepe, perhaps.
Sure.
Do we know anything about their religious practices? I mean, I know this is pre-writing, but do we know anything about, what's the significance of those T-shaped stela that are all over Gobekli Tepe?
Well, that's, even without the use of a language and there actually may be the rudiments of a written language there. Dr. Judkins has done some really good work, and I won't let it out of the bag because I want people to look at his analysis. But it's really fascinating on the similarities between some of the icons you find at Gobekli Tepe and the Luwian script, which is another ancient Anatolian. I think that Dr. Robert Schock has written a little bit about it, but you guys haven't. If you've read any of his work, you haven't seen anything yet until you see Dr. Judkins' analysis of this Luwian stuff and the similarities between the icons at Gobekli Tepe. But even without the benefit of a cohesive, literary tradition, written tradition, archaeologists can still make very significant and valid conclusions about the religious practices of those people that lived at Gobekli Tepe. And I should say lived at Gobekli Tepe because with quotations, because this is not your typical city. While there were small kinds of settlements on the outskirts of it, this was a religious complex by and large. It was a holy city. Much like you would find shrine sites or cities like a Mecca or a Jerusalem or what have you, Olympus. This was a sacred area that was not designated beyond the priesthood that was sort of developed around I should say quasi priesthood, not pseudo, but quasi priesthood. We actually can tell a fair amount about the religion. Now, you pointed out that these T-shaped pillars were some of the most, when people see pictures of Gobekli Tepe, they see these huge T-shaped pillars which are jutting out of the floor. They're actually stood up in basins on the floor of these temples. And what we think is that these were kind of the supports of the temple's roofing, and that the roofing was actually made out of animal skins.
Oh, okay.
And sort of thrown over them in kind of tent fashion, so that you had, half of the structure was built underground, and these pillars would support the overarching, sort of tent flap roofing that they would use. The imagery is on these T-shaped pillars is anthropomorphic. You have you can clearly see that there were arms that were artistically articulated on them on the sides. They're clearly reminiscent of human form. They have an animal pelt, probably a fox pelt, as a girdle. So the one thing that they're missing, or that most people say that they're missing, are heads, which may be an allusion to the practices of taking the heads off of deceased individuals. And treating them and sort of contextualizing the head as the seat of spirituality or what have you. But it may be that if there's anything to the elongated head, thesis of the Nephilim, that these may be representations of the Nephilim, and the shape of these pillars, these T-shaped pillars that we're, looking at, the T's themselves may represent these elongated heads, which of course is not something that falls under the rubric of conventional archaeological analysis.
No.
But it occurred to me when I was looking at them from the side is that, maybe these aren't headless. Maybe this is a mimicking, just because of the material that they're working with, because they're largely made out of soft limestone. Mm-hmm. And so, we have examples of them breaking while they're being constructed. So there's only so much that you could work with. You had to make them manageable so that you could move them. So there's a lot of stylization an abstraction in the art of Gobekli Tepe. And so it's not outside the realm of possibility when looking at this through the biblical lens, if there were, in fact, Chimera and Nephilim that had elongated heads at one point in time, that these T's could be sort of stylized, elongated heads.
That is fascinating, because one of the things that I was surprised to discover when I was researching my first book was how prevalent the practice of head shaping was in the ancient Near East.
Yes.
There haven't been a lot of papers written on it, but those who have, the scholars who've written about it, admit that the ancient Near East is ground zero for the practice of head shaping on planet Earth.
That's right. And, even with the oldest examples that we have of, head binding and the shaping of the skull, even without the benefit of writing, you can still, you get an implication that they're mimicking something.
Mm-hmm.
They're paying homage to something. And, you see this all around the world, is that, people that practice this, well, they say that they're giving homage to their gods, or they're giving homage to their first kings or whatever. It's to emulate these kings. Well, what did these kings and gods look like? That was something when I worked in Peru, looking at the Paracas stuff, that was something that you would hear from the people that kept the oral culture alive again and again, is that, well, the reason that the Paracas people did this is that they were emulating their earliest kings. I'm like, what do these things look like?
Yeah.
They would go to such an extent as to, deliberately malform their skulls to pay homage, oftentimes with a negative effect to their own person, because this was not a safe practice.
No. In fact, we were watching a documentary on the early years of Europe, the great tribal wanderings in the 3rd, 4th, 5th centuries AD. Mm-hmm. The Huns provoked a lot of that by pushing ahead of them tribes like the Ostrogoths and the Visigoths and the Huns, or rather the Vandals and the Alans and so on. And that really led to the collapse of the Western Roman Empire. But there was a skull that was found and that was exhibited during this this documentary of a woman who was in her 40s, I guess, at the time of her death, who had just a really unnaturally elongated skull. And they said, well, you can see where the head was bound here, but this was done as to the child when it's very young, when the child's skull is growing and developing, of course. And the archaeologist working on the reconstruction of the face said this would not have been a painless process. So the thing that stunned me was that from the time of Gobekli Tepe, this pre-pottery Neolithic A period, 10,000 BC or thereabouts, down to about the time of the rise of the Uruk civilization, 4,000 BC or thereabouts. According to what I've been able to find by the scholars who've dared to look into this, because this is sort of like venturing into woo territory.
Yeah.
It appears that this was the standard in the ancient Near East, what we would call today Iraq, Syria, Western Iran, Southern Turkey, Jordan, Israel, Lebanon. Almost every set of remains that they found, down to about 4,000 BC, using their timing, their dating, is deformed. In fact, at the earliest graves that they found at Eridu, which I believe is the site of the Tower of Babel, they excavated back in 1949, 206 sets of remains, if I remember correctly. I've got it in my book. I think it was 206, but they found that all 206 sets of remains had deformed skulls, although the guy who did the excavating said, well, it was probably due to earth pressure after death. Okay, fine. But scholars who come afterward have said, nah, we don't think so. So again, this is something that went on for a very, very long time in the pre-flood world. Mm-hmm. And it all seems to be centered, generally speaking, in the ancient Near East. Have remains been found at Gobekli Tepe? And what did they find?
So far as I know, I mean, there certainly have been some remains that have been recovered. And in terms of in terms of a recovery of articulated skeletons in the deceased, we have better sampling from sites like nearby contemporary sites like Novali Chari and Shanlurfa. There are a couple of other ones that have been coming on the radar recently, just because more excavation has been done. But yeah, we do find some remains at Gobekli Tepe, but it's sparse, and to my knowledge, there haven't been any headbound, skulls, elongated skulls. But you got to remember, only a fraction of that site has been excavated. There's there's decades and decades and decades, of work left to do there. I don't think even a third of the site has been completely excavated. So you remember, you're talking 300 square meters here. That's a huge chunk of territory to survey and excavate, and then you have to analyze. You have to find things that are diagnostic. You have to analyze all that stuff. You have to put archaeology is a slow process, and there's a reason for that, because the hermeneutics that go into archaeology have to be carefully weighed. I've told the story a number of times on your show about the article that I read when I was in graduate school about for purposes of illustration, I'll just tell it again. It's a fun story. But the reason that archaeologists are slow about this stuff is because interpretation has to be very carefully made, because you can blunder something very quickly if you're not weighing all of your diagnostic artifacts and being careful with the interpretation of features, especially if you don't have the benefit of written materials to go along with it. And so in this article, this little trick that our professor played on us has these archaeologists excavating this place in the future. It's 2,000 or 3,000 years in the future, and they find this antechamber, and they're very excited about it. They chisel into it, break into it, and what do they find? Well, they find what they think is a royal burial. It's this huge complex, many rooms, and they find this antechamber, and there's an articulated skeleton in an open sarcophagus, and surrounding him are these precious gems around the rim of this sarcophagus, and he's wearing a headpiece, and he has in his hand a scepter, and across from him is what they deem to be a royal urn for burning incense, and directly across from that is a huge ornate, polished mirror, and a sacrificial basin where animals could be blood sacrifices could be offered and could drain through the bottom. And it was ornately tiled and very, very beautiful. And there were metal hangings from the ceiling, and it was just this, it was heralded as this huge find. Well, these archaeologists in the future didn't have the proper context to make an accurate analysis of this. What they had actually found was a bathroom in a Motel 6.
Yeah.
Somebody whatever
died in the tub, yeah.
had destroyed them. This poor guy was in the tub, and the gems around the sarcophagus was the tub. The gems were pieces of dried soap. The scepter was a brush. His headpiece was a cap. The urn, the censer urn, was the toilet, and the sacrificial basin was the sink. And you can see how we can laugh about that, but there's also a serious side to it, and it's why archaeology has to be slow in its interpretation, is because if you don't have the proper context, you could get this Hotel of the Gods interpretation of whatever you find. But having said that, there's still so much to do at Gobekli Tepe with only a fraction of the site being found. And so absence of evidence is not necessarily evidence of absence.
Right.
Because we find these elongated skulls in other sites in the region, and evidence of head binding, that's not to say that we won't find it in the region of Gobekli Tepe.
Well, in the region of Gobekli Tepe, a site that you've mentioned a couple of times now, I want to pivot to this quickly because we're almost an hour in, and I do like to try to keep these to about an hour or thereabouts so that they're not too much of a time burden on those who listen. But this is going by very quickly, and I hope you listeners are having finding this as interesting as I am. Shanlurfa, is that how it's pronounced?
Mm-hmm. That's right.
Believed by many in the area to be the hometown of Abraham, and I certainly agree that is more likely, that region anyway is more likely to be the hometown or where Abraham originated than in southeast Iraq. In fact, until Sir Leonard Woolley found the fabulous royal tombs of back in the 1920s, it was assumed that Abraham had originated in Anatolia, in southern Turkey, because that's where he sent his servant back to go find a bride for Isaac, and that's where there are cities that have been found now that are named for, or perhaps Abraham's relatives are named for those cities. There are a lot of clues in the scriptures, in not least of which is Joshua reminding the Israelites that they had to cross the river, that their ancestors crossed the river to get to the Promised Land. And in Iraq is on the west side of the Euphrates, whereas Şanlıurfa and others in Turkey are on the east side of the Euphrates. So what is significant to you about Şanlıurfa?
Well, as you say, it was Leonard Woolley's work in 1927 that sort of set the pace for this change in thinking about where Ur of the Chaldees was. But that, the Chaldeans themselves originate from this region in eastern Anatolia, sort of northern Syria, what the Bible described as the region of Haran. Mm-hmm. They don't even end up in southern Mesopotamia until the 10th and 9th century BC. That's a historical fact. And so if Moses is writing all of this before that, then the Chaldeans are not even in southern Mesopotamia at the time.
And that's assuming that's an accurate translation of the Hebrew, because in the Hebrew it's actually Kasdim.
Kasdim, that's
Kasdim, right.
That was going to be my next point.
Okay.
The word Chaldean is not even used in the Hebrew. The Hebrew rendering there, and they're all because of time constraints, we may have to do another show here next month or something. But there are all kinds of phonetic tie-ins with identity, personalities that you find in not only the Table of Nations, but also in some of the apocryphal literature like Jasher and Jubilees. There's an interesting guy, Arphaxad, mm-hmm. who is also associated with this region, and I have seen sort of phonetic equations, if you want to call them that, linguistic equations, saying that Kesadim is related to Arphaxad in some way. But the Kesed, is another personality from these apocryphal, sources who's also associated with this region. There are a number of other references to the region of Haran, and you pointed out a couple of those. But suffice to say, logically, it just makes more sense that Abraham's Ur would be in this region. And we certainly know that there was a city-state that existed there that would have fit within the time frame of the biblical patriarchs, the post-flood patriarchs. And so I think the zenith of this city-state was somewhere between about 2200 and 1800 BC. Which certainly would have, if you put Abraham on the far end of that, the biblical patriarchal period is generally from about 2000 to about 1500 BC. Abraham's, however long he lived there would have fit within that time frame. So archaeologically, we're certainly able to verify that there was a city-state there, and it changed hands, between the Hurrians and the Mitanni and it seems like the Akkadians. It was a vassal of the Akkadian Empire at some point in time, and so the Mesopotamian influence there was, it was very clear that you're looking at Mesopotamian religion, sort of being the backdrop of all of that. It sort of falls into an interregnum where a lot of the Chaldeans, if you will, that would have lived there, migrated to the south after that, but that doesn't start happening, I think, until about that migration doesn't begin until after that point, and of course they don't end up in southern Mesopotamia till about the 10th century BC. Anyway. Right.
But one of the other aspects of this, and this is one of the things that I really find fascinating, is there's a Hurrian cultural center and political center that dates to, I think its origins date to about 3000 BC or perhaps a little earlier, but in the time of Abraham, was under the influence of the Amorite kingdom of Mari, which is down on the Euphrates River near where Syria and Iraq's border exists today.
You're talking about Urkesh?
I'm talking about the city of Urkesh, yes, which phonetically might be similar enough to Ur-Kasidim or Kashidim, that there are those who believe that Urkesh might be the city that we're looking for here. This is about 100, and I just looked it up on the map while we were talking. It's about 110, 115 miles south-southeast or east-southeast of Gobekli Tepe. And again, Gobekli Tepe is only about 6 miles from Şanlıurfa.
Right.
So we're talking about 110 miles just over to the east. And during this period that the king of Mari, named Zimri Lim, was the overlord of Urkesh, he installed a client king whose name was Teru, which is very similar to the name of Abraham's father, Terah.
Terah.
Yeah. So maybe coincidence, might be, but we know from a surviving text found at Mari that this Teru was not very popular with the local Hurrians, the native Hurrians. Zimri Lim is in this letter that he sent back said, "I was not aware that the sons of Urkesh hate you on my account. Nevertheless, you belong to me." In other words, you do what I tell you to do. But could that be why that Terah and Abraham decided they wanted to get out of Dodge? I mean,
it's possible. You know, I'm not so married to the Şanlıurfa thesis that it couldn't be, Ur couldn't be another city like Urkesh. You're still dealing with the same general region.
Yeah.
It'll be interesting to see, if there are more biblical scholars that begin to look at this region and its association with Gobekli Tepe.
Yeah.
But Dr. Judkins and I just decided to do it because nobody else was doing it.
Well, and certainly not from a Christian perspective. The other connection, and I guess we will have to do another program on this, hopefully, when we'll get a little closer to the release of your book, but the city of Urkesh and the religious center there was devoted to the chief god of the Hurrians, who was Kumarbi, who in my last book and in Last Clash of the Titans uncovered a bunch of scholarly research that agrees that Kumarbi of the Hurrians and Hittites was the same entity called Enlil by the Sumerians and the Akkadians, El by the Amorites, Kronos of the Greeks, Saturn to the Romans, and Baal Haman to the Phoenicians, also Dagon to the Amorites and the Phoenicians, or the Philistines. So this was a very important center of worship, and the place of worship was a place called the Abi, which was a ritual pit where they would communicate with him because he was in the underworld. So again, this was another portal type structure for communicating with the other side. And then you get into the whole etymology of the Abi and the Semitic root word ov, which means which means medium or spirits of the ancestors. So we've got a lot more that we can cover on this, but I think the bottom line for this episode, Gobekli Tepe, oldest religious center on Earth, was built as a religious center, did not develop out of a pre-existing civilization, and has something to do with a sudden shift in the type of worship of humans. And your theory and Dr. Judkins' theory that it was under the influence of these supernatural entities that we would call watchers.
Certainly. And, it's this, this time of the year when Halloween rolls around, people begin to look at the roots of Halloween, particularly the Western European roots. It's this time when the veil between this world and the next is supposed to be the thinnest so that you can communicate with these deities. Well, you have these centers like Gobekli Tepe and all of the ones that are culturally influenced by them in later years, including Urkesh and ones that are strewn around that region. That's exactly what they're trying to do at these places.
Well, again, it's a very, very old practice that, we're still seeing it today all over the world, not just here in America, but certainly with the Halloween season upon us, the Day of the Dead, and various cultures from the Far East to the various places in the Southern Hemisphere. The veneration of the dead has been with us for a very long time. It has never gone away, but you can trace it all back, to Mount Hermon and perhaps even before now at Gobekli Tepe.
Mm-hmm.
When is the book supposed to be out? Do you have a time on that yet?
First quarter is what we're thinking next year.
Okay. Has a title been settled on that yet, or is that still being discussed?
That's one thing that we're still working on.
Never fear. Tom Horn will come up with a title and then a subtitle.
No doubt. I was thinking if we can't, I know that Tom can.
Dr. Judd Burton and his co-author, Dr. Aaron Judkins, will get you both on to talk about the book when that's ready. And I'm sure we'll probably have you out here in the Ozarks when it's ready to go. Your website, burtonbeyond.com. Where else would people find you on the web? burtonbeyond.com, and the Institute webpage is tioba.org. And I'm in the process of updating those sites, so they'll have a new look probably starting this next month. And people can follow me on YouTube and Twitter, and I'm branching out into other social media platforms as well, as we all kind of are these days, because of censorship and whatnot. Right, yeah.
I've also got a little... on a lighter note, I've got a little book on Christmas coming out on Bible study. It's 12 days of Christmas Bible studies, basically little historical meditations on the elements of the nativity story, and so that's kind of a fun little book. And if I can, I just wanted to give a shout out to my friend Dr. Pam Neff Haley. She works with the local charter schools, and many of which are devoted to classical methods and classical education, which we need. And I just wanted to give her a shout out.
Absolutely. All right. Dr. Judd Burton, always a pleasure, and we will do this again soon.
Looking forward to it.
As always, links to our guests' websites are in the show notes at vftb.net. You'll find Dr. Judd Burton's personal website, Burton Beyond, and the Institute of Biblical Anthropology, the link in the show notes, whether at vftb.net or wherever else you happen to be listening to this or viewing this. If you're actually watching this at the YouTube channel and staring at that static image while listening to these words, there are links in the notes below the video, and you can find Judd's work there. Coming up, what could be the biggest conspiracy in American history, and news of 2 new books by yours truly coming out next week, besides the one you're about to hear about. Tell you what I mean, straight ahead on A View from the Bunker.
There were giants in the earth in those days. And also after that. It was a time of gods and dragons.
This was supernatural war between Jesus, God, and the old gods.
We live in the final stage of a war that began before God said, "Let there be light."
The gods of ancient Sumer.
These giants are all through the Bible.
The things that are going on in the world right now, I'm sorry, but the writers, they're out.
Now, a fresh look at the end times that reveals the prophecy of the giants at Armageddon. Names the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse already loose in the world today.
These entities are real entities and not just metaphors or symbols.
And they're all named.
Unmasks the ancient dragons who will walk the earth during the Great Tribulation.
A primordial entity such as Kronos or Chaos, Leviathan, Tiamat.
His breath kindles coals and a flame comes forth from his mouth. What is he describing here if not a dragon?
And unveils hidden prophecies of their ultimate destruction. Giants, Gods, and Dragons by Sharon K. Gilbert and Derek P. Gilbert. New from Defender Publishing.
Shall we begin? Let's begin now.
Talking the walk every Sunday night from the beautiful Missouri Ozarks. This is A View from the Bunker. I'm Derek Gilbert. You'll find us online at vftb.net, and you will find our links to the app stores for the free mobile app there as well. That's the easiest way to keep track of us. Just carry us around in your smartphone or tablet, whether it's iOS or Android. A free app available for both of those, and you'll find the links to the app stores in the right-hand column at vftb.net. You'll also find links to the social media sites there as well. Do remember, we're on parlay.com now. I know I keep hearing people say parlor. I don't speak French, although I did take 8 years of French between high school, junior high, college. But I do know enough to know that P-A-R-L-E-R is French for to speak, and it is parlay.com. Derek P. Gilbert, my handle there. Well, the biggest scandal in American history, you might say, okay, what? Teapot Dome, if you've got a sense of history. Watergate, perhaps? I mean, it's given it that term, that suffix gate to every scandal since the early 1970s. Saw a funny routine on it once where guys were trying to figure out what to call Watergate. If it's a scandal, shouldn't it be Watergate Gate? Anyway, no, I would argue that the biggest scandal, not even the attempt by the deep state, the intelligence community, the FBI, and the ginned up FISA warrants based on, as we learned a couple of weeks ago, information fed to the media by the FBI that the FBI then wrote up reports on that were then leaked back to the media, so that the media was then playing an active role in helping the FBI convince the FISA court that there was some smoke there to warrant spying on American citizens, members of the Trump presidential campaign. But even that is not the biggest conspiracy. I would argue that the biggest conspiracy in American history, that is being exposed now by characters you may not like. I mean, if you're a Christian and you didn't vote for Donald Trump in 2016, don't plan to vote for him again this time around. Okay, I can understand it, but at the very least, we owe him a debt of gratitude for forcing the deep state to show its hand. The two-headed sock puppet that is run by the political class in Washington, D.C., wants him out of there because he's not approved. As former Speaker of the House Newt Gingrich once said, Trump is not in favor with the media or with the elites in Washington because he doesn't know the secret handshake. He doesn't belong to the secret society. And so the political class and his allies in the media have pulled out all the stops to try to make sure he does not get reelected. And that means essentially deciding what not to report because it might reflect badly on Democrats. I wish that was original thought to me. It is not. I forget the journalist who coined that phrase, but I see it pop up time and again as people come back to that meme. But it is true. It is true. Being a journalist in 21st century America means deciding what not to report because it might reflect badly on Democrats. And that's exactly what's happening right now as I record this on Sunday, October 25th, 2020. The media deciding not to report on Hunter Biden's laptop and the contents thereof. Those contents are being distributed thanks to Steve Bannon and a dissident Chinese billionaire who runs a website called G News. They are putting out information that is, well, it's really stomach churning when you see this stuff. And I'm not even going to look at it because it's not appropriate. And secondly, it's really not relevant. I mean, the bigger story is not what Hunter Biden got involved in with as far as illicit drugs and his private sexual activities. What's really relevant here are his business activities and on whose behalf he conducted those activities. And there's enough evidence there to suggest that Joe Biden monetized the White House, his office inside the White House, just as Hillary Clinton appears to have monetized the Secretary of State's office while she was in office. Now, certainly, they are not the first politicians to enrich themselves, taking advantage of the political power that they wielded to line their own pockets. But given that the Vice President of the United States was taking point on some rather important foreign policy initiatives, like our relationship with Ukraine, which, if you look at a map, you'll notice it's next door to Russia, and thus has some fairly important implications. Our relationship with Ukraine vis-a-vis how we deal with Russia, and likewise our relationship with China, which is on track to become the global superpower before the end of the 21st century. If Mr. Biden was leading foreign policy initiatives with both of those nations, and his son was somehow raking in millions of dollars from parties inside Ukraine and Russia and China, as appears to be the case from the information we now have, not just from the laptop that was left at the shop in Delaware, but from the former business partner who gave his press conference just prior to the final presidential debate this past week. Wouldn't it be worth the time for some enterprising journalists to ask some very pointed questions? Because Democrats have spent the last 4 years pointing fingers at Donald Trump and saying that he's a national security risk because he's Putin's puppet. When it appears that former Vice President Biden had more reasons to be friendly to parties inside Russia and perhaps Ukraine and perhaps China, if in fact the information contained on the laptop and information given to the Senate Intelligence Committee, chaired by Senator Ron Johnson of Wisconsin, by Hunter Biden's former business partner, if that information is any way correct, shouldn't the American public know this before we cast our votes? Shouldn't we know whether Joe Biden is in fact in the pocket of the Chinese Communist Party or the Kremlin? I mean, we spent 4 years hearing all of these breathless exposés about how the Trump presidency was about to end because of bombshells about his relationship with Vladimir Putin and how he was trying to pressure Ukraine on behalf of Vladimir Putin, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It turned out to all be bogus. What we do know, as far as Chinese, or rather Russian collusion, is that the phony FISA court dossier was created by Christopher Steele, the MI6 operative, with information that he got from a Russian intelligence asset. It appears that this last 4 years was simply the Democrats in Washington and their media allies projecting onto the White House all the stuff that Hillary had been doing. And now it appears Joe Biden as well. But you wouldn't know it from watching the mainstream media. Fox is reporting some of this. Breitbart News is reporting it. And if you're listening to this program, you're probably aware of a lot of what I'm telling you. So it is probably not a surprise to you, anything that I'm saying. What is interesting is in talking to, now I won't identify the person because I don't want to embarrass anyone, but just in talking about the COVID situation and how blessed we are here in the Ozarks, that things are pretty much open. We can go into a restaurant, sit down, and have a meal without being advised by our governor, Mike Parson, to put our mask on in between bites, like Governor Newsom in California. And yet I told somebody this who lives in a larger city, and they said, oh, that's unfortunate. Well, my response was, without thinking, well, it's unfortunate if you don't live here, because for us, life is pretty much back open, but I'm aware that that's not the case in many other parts of the country. And this person, it dawned on me that this person gets their news from more conventional sources. And as with the news of Hunter Biden's business dealings, the way this outbreak has been reported is tailored in such a way as to reflect badly on President Trump and not on Democrats. So no point in arguing the point, because for that person, it's just a reminder that how we consume news and the filters that are between us and what's happening in the real world, whether it's Google or the news choices that we make on cable or on the internet, shape reality for us. Because to this person I was speaking to today, reality was that this is a deadly virus that might kill us all. When you look at the CDC's statistics, in fact, that is not the case. It is dangerous to people over the age of 70. And yes, it is worse than the seasonal flu, but for people under the age of 50, not much worse. Certainly not bad enough to warrant locking down the entire economy. So this is another example. How the political situation in America is being reported right now is another example of how the media is fully in bed with political class in Washington, D.C. and around the world, and is shaping the information that they will allow through their filters to shape reality. The question is, are there enough Americans, are there enough citizens of the world who are actively going around the gatekeepers to find out what's really going on? Well, we'll find out in a couple of weeks, but if things don't go the way we hope, remember, God is still in control, and he is not surprised. He will not be surprised by anything that has happened. And just as the early church was able to survive, in fact, to thrive under the rule of really cruel, sadistic, and perverse emperors like Caligula and Nero, we can survive whoever occupies the Oval Office for the next 4 years. Well, we've got some interesting things coming from both Skywatch TV and from us here at Gilbert House. Skywatch TV, we're looking forward to 2021. Can't get past 2020 fast enough. Tom Horn's forthcoming book is a follow-up to the Wormwood Prophecy. That'll be out before Christmas. The four programs devoted to our new book, Sharon's and my new book, Giants, Gods, and Dragons, began airing this week. So this broadcast week, it will be out there coast to coast. You can find the broadcast schedule at skywatchtv.com/channels if you're interested. You can also find the program right now at the very top of the page at skywatchtv.com. That's our first 30-minute program on the new book. And because we cover a lot of ground in the book, we pretty much had to limit each program to one topic, kind of. But when Sharon and Tom Horn and I sit down and talk, it's always a really lively conversation. So I think you'll enjoy it. The first program, we dealt with the four horsemen of the apocalypse. And Sharon and I believe that those four horsemen, if you've been watching us for a while, following our Unraveling Revelation series at Skywatch TV, you know that we believe that those four horsemen are already out and riding. We explain why during this first program. The other four programs will be released over the next 4 weeks. But got two other books by myself. I occasionally write on my own, and I've got a couple of novels coming out. Now, these are things that I previously wrote, but seemed timely, both in terms of the book that Sharon and I now have coming out from Defender Publishing, which, by the way, due to a paper shortage, is scheduled to be out by the end of the month. We were hoping to have it this week, but because of a paper shortage, believe it or not, the book will be out at the end of the month. But the novel Iron Dragons, which I originally began writing back in 2002, I've updated it, re-edited it, wanted to add a little more supernatural flavor to it. It is a fantasy science fiction mashup. I never truly, other than Tolkien, really enjoyed fiction or fantasy fiction. So I had to bring in a science fiction element to it. I will have a trailer done on this for release probably later in the week. And my novel, The God Conspiracy, also coming out as of next weekend. Roughly speaking, November 1st, but it'll probably be during the weekend. And I'll have a trailer on that one as well. That one just seemed timely because of the political situation here in the United States right now. The novel builds on Sharon's 2005 novel, The Armageddon Strain, which featured a controversial vaccine, which included something called the biostrain chip. And she allowed me to borrow some of the characters from the Armageddon Strain. So if you've read the Armageddon Strain, you'll recognize some of the characters in the God Conspiracy, as well as the biostrain chip. When I tried writing these before, I didn't have a deep enough understanding of theology to really take the stories much further than I did. Both have been updated, re-edited, and will be out next week. So keep watching my website, DerekPGilbert.com, and there will be more about the God Conspiracy and Iron Dragons coming out next week from Rose Avenue Fiction. A reminder that the Hear the Watchman conference that had been scheduled for November 5th through 8th, which then had been transformed into a tent revival because it appeared that the state of California is still a little leery about gathering in large groups. Well, that has been canceled. Mike Kerr and Jeannie Moore had to make the tough decision to cancel that event altogether. Apparently, the media got wind that a Christian organization wanted to gather at the Hilton Irvine and have a revival, a tent revival. And so suddenly the Hilton was getting queries from local media asking, well, what are you going to do for social distancing? Are you going to require masks? Are you going to contact trace the people in case somebody brings the virus? So the Hilton had actually gotten in touch with Mike and Jeannie and wanted a list, name, address, phone number of everyone who was going to attend. And so to their credit, Mike and Jeannie said, we're not doing that. So sadly, that has been canceled. They're looking at to 2021. And as I said, we can't get into 2021 fast enough as far as I'm concerned. In fact, I know that they are planning on a return to Dallas in late March. Early March, Sharon and I, along with L.A. Marzulli, planning to be in Murfreesboro, Tennessee for the Decoding the Supernatural conference. This will be hosted by Jeff Jansen and Global Fire Ministries. In fact, we're supposed to be out in North Carolina to meet with Jeff in just a couple of weeks, because he's got a new program out there called Decoding the Supernatural. LA will be there as well. So you can find more information online. It's still early days, so not a whole lot up there, but globalfireministries.com. The dates March 4th through 7th, 2021. Sharon, me, L.A. Marzulli, Jeff Jansen at his church, Global Fire Ministries in Murfreesboro, Tennessee. And then April of next year, the Skywatch TV Tour of Israel still on April 18th through May 1st, 2021. We're looking forward to getting back to the Holy Land and seeing you there as well. And really turning this into a sort of a rolling conference as we go from place to place and show you why we say the rocks are almost literally crying out here in these last days. There are archaeological discoveries that previous generations just didn't know about, that confirm what we've been reading in the Bible and help us to understand some of the stranger parts of the Bible. To find out more, cost, itinerary, and so forth, log on to skywatchinisrael.com, skywatchinisrael.com. And do take advantage of the optional 4-day extension to Jordan, because we'll go to Petra, explain why that's not just a really cool place to see, but spiritually significant. Mount Nebo, that God called the Mountain of the Travelers. And remember, travelers was the term applied by the pagan Canaanites to the spirits, the demonic spirits of the Rephaim. And then look up the word travelers in Ezekiel 39, verse 11, and see if you think that maybe that's significant. All of that at skywatchinisrael.com. Thank you for taking the time to listen tonight, whether it's Spreaker, Stitcher, iTunes. Well, it's not iTunes anymore. It's Apple Podcast, Google Podcast, iHeartRadio, Amazon Music now, Spotify, or wherever else you find us, which is, of course, wherever fine podcasts are sold. A View from the Bunker is a production of Gilbert House, released under Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivatives 4.0 International License. Our announcer is D.C. Good. Remember, we wrestle not against flesh and blood. I'm Derek Gilbert, and this is A View from the Bunker.